Creator, may your spirit and guidance be in us as we work for the benefit of all our people, for peace and justice in our land, and for the constant recognition of the dignity and aspirations of those whom we serve. Amen.
Good afternoon, members. Minister's statement. Minister, good day in the Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, on January 16, 2019, I had the honour of signing the Self-Government Agreement in Principle for the Saulteaux, Dene and Métis of Norman Wells, alongside our negotiating partners, the Government of Canada and the Norman Wells Land Corporation. Reaching this self-government agreement in principle represents a significant step in the journey towards fulfilling the obligation to negotiate self-government in the 1993 Saulteaux, Dene and Métis Comprehensive Land Claim Agreement. More importantly, this agreement in principle represents a key milestone in the journey towards self-government and self-determination for the Saulteaux, Dene and Métis of the Northwest of Norman Wells. Mr. Speaker, the work of negotiating and concluding land, resources and self-government agreements can be challenging, but it is essential if we are to build the Northwest Territories and Canada that we all want to be a part of. A territory and a country where our long history of working and living together is protected and where the rights of Indigenous peoples are protected for future generations. While there are similarities between self-government agreements in the Northwest Territories, there are also many unique aspects that take into account the different needs and self-government priorities of the communities. Simply stated, a one-size-fits-all approach does not work here in the Northwest Territories. The agreement in principle for the Saulteaux, Dene and Métis of Norman Wells is a good example of our commitment to negotiating self-government agreements that reflect the unique realities of each community. The agreement in principle considers how to implement the inherent right for the Saulteaux, Dene and Métis of Norman Wells in a community where they comprise a smaller proportion of the overall population. This agreement in principle is flexible and forward-looking in that it allows for changes in the governance model as the population demographics change in the future. Mr. Speaker, I am proud that in the Northwest Territories we have a shared history of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people living, working, and governing together. This is reflected in the fabric of our communities, in the languages we speak, and in the cultural and business decisions we make. This milestone achievement is something that should be celebrated by all Northerners, not just residents of Norman Wells and the Saulteaux region. That is because we know and believe that completed agreements are the basis for realizing our true social and economic potential by clarifying and providing certainty with respect to Aboriginal and treaty rights. With one milestone reached, the parties are already looking ahead and have commenced negotiations on a final self-government agreement for the Saulteaux, Dene and Métis of Norman Wells. Completing these negotiations continues to be one of the most powerful and meaningful ways that we can demonstrate our commitment to reconciliation and to empowering our people to be self-sufficient and self-determining. Mr. Speaker, I wish to acknowledge the hard work by the negotiating teams who have helped us get to this important moment in history. Congratulations to all of the parties on this momentous achievement, And most importantly, congratulations to the Saulteaux and Dene and Métis of Norman Wells. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister Statement. Minister Ike, go down in the Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, from January 16th to the 17th, 2019, the Department of Municipal and Community Affairs brought government leaders together to discuss cannabis. This was our first opportunity for such a gathering since cannabis became legal in Canada on October 17th, 2018. Mr. Speaker, the legalization of cannabis presents challenges for Northern society. The purpose of this conference was to look for local solutions for community governments as they deal with this new reality. Our focus was presenting as much information as possible for local leaders with the right experts available to answer as many questions as possible. The first part of the conference addressed the legislative framework for the management of legal cannabis. I wish to express my thanks to the following departments or agencies who made their officials available. The Department of Finance, who presented on their legislation and the new retail process. The Department of Health and Social Services, who presented on cannabis smoking control and health promotion efforts. The Department of Infrastructure and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who presented on changes to the Motor Vehicles Act and associated efforts to manage impaired driving. The Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission and the law firm of McClellan Ross, who led an excellent session on labor relations and human resources. And the Municipal and Community Affairs staff, who presented on community-based planning, zoning, and bylaw-making authority. The conference included a keynote speaker from Manitoba who brought a national perspective, as well as a speaker from Colorado with an international view. In addition to the presentations, our conference organizers also provided a wide range of resources for delegates to take away and continue their learning. Mr. Speaker, I believe there are lessons we can take away from this conference. First, despite the state of Colorado legalizing cannabis many years ago, they are still dealing with the effects of this change today, and there will be more for us to learn going forward. Second, we know that despite providing considerable information and resources to community leaders, there is a thirst for even more information and a need to continue this discussion locally in our communities. Finally, we heard from communities that while cannabis is now legal, there are still many impacts of drugs and alcohol that are having a continued effect on our communities and our residents, especially our youth. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased that our government is continuing an aggressive public awareness campaign in the coming year. I especially commend the efforts of the Department of Health and Social Services with community-based workshops, as well as social marketing efforts using cutting-edge techniques such as augmented reality. All of this is aimed at supporting our youth as they deal with this change, and I'm grateful for these efforts. Mr. Speaker, I believe community leaders were pleased with the information that they received. The Department of Municipal and Community Affairs will assist communities on issues related to community planning and local controls, and from a human resources perspective as they establish proper policies for their workplaces. We have only had legal cannabis for a little over 5 months. We cannot expect to have all the answers today, but Municipal and Community Affairs will continue to support our communities and our residents as we all adapt to the reality of legal cannabis in the coming months and years. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister Statement. Minister Ike, go down in the Minister of Environment and Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know you and all the members here understand the importance of barren ground caribou to our communities. Caribou are central to the way of life in the North and have sustained people here for many generations. This is why, together, this Legislative Assembly made a mandate commitment to improve food security in the Northwest Territories through the effective co-management of wildlife, including caribou. Part of achieving this commitment requires recognizing that caribou are a shared resource, and we need to work together with our co-management partners, including the federal government, Indigenous governments, regulatory boards, industry and other stakeholders, to make shared decisions. Mr. Speaker, last year the government of the Northwest Territories carried out population surveys on 5 of our territory's barren ground caribou herds: the Cape Bathurst, Tuktoyaktuk Peninsula, Blue Nose West and Blue Nose East, and the Bathurst caribou. The results of these surveys were not favorable, and in November I shared the details of these results with members and the public. What we learned was that while populations of the 3 northern herds have stayed relatively stable, unfortunately the Blue Nose East and Bathurst herds continue to experience significant declines. The results were alarming in that both of these populations have been reduced by half or more over the last 3 years, despite extensive co-management actions between the N.W.T and Indigenous governments and renewable resource boards to support barren ground conservation and promote herd recovery. Mr. Speaker, we know that these results were concerning to the public, and the N.W.T shares these concerns. We know our communities are struggling without caribou, and that many families have already sacrificed a lot to help the herds recover. As you know, there has been no harvest of Bathurst caribou since 2015, and harvest of the Blue Nose East herd has been significantly reduced. However, the caribou continue to need our help. In the months since I shared these results with our co-management partners and the public, I have been meeting with Indigenous leaders and affected communities to talk about the low caribou numbers and hear their ideas for how we can work together to take care of the herds. I want to particularly thank the Clecho leadership who have emphasized the importance of strong collaboration with the N.W.T to address this urgent situation. Our 2 governments have been working very closely together over the past few months to consider what we can do to help support the caribou. Mr. Speaker, the Department of ENR and myself are committed to meeting with as many of our co-management partners and Indigenous governments as we can to discuss this issue. At the end of January, I traveled with Clecho leadership to N.W.T, Wekwati, Gamete, and Betchiko. I also met with the chiefs of the Yellowknife Dene, and my officials met with First Nations and Métis leadership in Fort Smith. Earlier this month, the ENR also held meetings with Lutso First Nation and the North Slave Métis Alliance on February 18, 2019. One of the suggestions we continue to hear at these meetings that more needs to be done to deal with predators, namely wolves, and I agree. This is why the N.W.T has increased the incentives we offer to wolf harvesters in the North Slave region, specifically on the wintering grounds of the Bathurst and Blue Nose East caribou. The Enhanced Incentive Program is meant to encourage harvesters to take more wolves on the range of the Bathurst and Blue Nose East caribou. At the same time, we are also looking at what more we can do together with the Clecho government to reduce the impacts of predators on caribou population. But predators are only part of the picture, Mr. Speaker. For the past few months, the N.W.T has been working closely with the Clecho government to draft 2 joint management proposals, one for Bathurst caribou herd and one for Blue Nose East. These proposals lay out actions our 2 governments are proposing to take to help the herds recover, including harvest management, habitat protection, and increased research and monitoring. The proposals also reflect the recommendations in the Bathurst Caribou Range Plan. This plan is in the final stages of approval and will ensure we are managing activities on the land in a way that supports the recovery of our caribou herds. Both proposals are now with the Wakwiji Renewable Resource Board for review. Mr. Speaker, in the Sahtu, the N.W.T continues to support a community-based approach to conservation planning for the Blue Nose East caribou herd, centered around Delaunay's Caribou Conservation Plan. This is a plan that has been endorsed by both the Sahtu Renewable Resource Board and the N.W.T. This is the process outlined in our established co-management system, and we have complete confidence in both boards to make smart, effective decisions in the best interest of Caribou and the people of the Northwest Territories. I have also been speaking with my colleague in Nunavut, as the calving grounds and important post-calving areas for both Bathurst and Blue-Nosed East Caribou are in Nunavut. I am making arrangements to meet with Premier Joe Civitak this spring, who is also a Minister of the Environment. My hope is for us to sit down with Indigenous leaders from both sides of the border to talk about what steps we can take to help our shared caribou herds. Mr. Speaker, I know this is a passionate issue for many. We need to avoid the temptation to point fingers and instead focus on working together to make decisions that support the caribou. We know from both science and traditional knowledge that caribou populations have undergone sharp declines and rapid increases in the past. We all have a role to play during this current low, and the N.W.T will continue to work with all of our co-management partners through established wildlife co-management processes to ensure caribou can continue to sustain present and future generation of Northerners. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Minister statements. Minister statements. Member statements. Member for N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I notice that the Divisional Education Board Office has 2 fewer staff supporting the schools than the SAW-2. In the Detroit proper 8 communities, we have 2 support staff for 9 schools, whereas the SAW-2 has 4 support staff for 5 schools. It is my understanding that SAW-2 board has 2 IT support staff, while the Detroit has 1. This doesn't seem right. We need to address this, or we're going to see more vulnerable children and ongoing decline in the EDI and MDI results for the Detroit. It is my position that the base funding based on the number of students doesn't work. I would like to suggest a new base formula that guarantees a minimum staffing regardless of the number of students. This would be based on the understanding that it does not matter how many students you have in the school. You need a part-time custodian, principal, secretary, program support teacher, and teachers. There are districts in BC that use this approach with better results for the students. For example, a principal has reports to write for the central office and for ECE, no matter how many students are in the school. But we have some administrators who teach all days. They have no time for administration. Once this basic funding is in place, other formulas should kick in, is based on the number of students, with the understanding that you will need 2 teachers no matter what. I recommend to the staff, the department, that we see additional funding for the Detroit Divisional Education Council in the following areas. Language support person to help with the translation, as well. This position will help promote the revitalization of Indigenous language in the region. An intern program support teacher whose focus would be to step in where school has a vacancy or where there is an illness. A position would focus entirely on curriculum support. She or he would ensure the students are not falling behind and would build an education program. A curriculum support supervisor. This person would carry the profile of literacy, numeracy, and writing, ensuring the students get the support they need. I will have questions for the Minister of EC&E later today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Godin and the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the framework used by the Department of Education, Culture and Employment to fund schools is not working in the Detroit, and it's not working in Hay River. We're lucky that over the years, the schools in Hay River have had many skilled and dedicated principals, teachers, and support staff, and have been governed by equally dedicated education authority members. It's because of all of them that Hay River has had better educational outcomes than most places in the territory. However, Mr. Speaker, this success has come despite ECE's funding framework, which has proven itself too rigid and not responsive to our community's changing demographics. Every year, we see cuts to funding that are out of line with the actual needs of schools and students. As I said, we've been fortunate that our education authorities have members who are very engaged and who are willing to put in the time and effort to make the tough decisions about how to allocate the ever-dwindling funds. We're also lucky enough to have principals who have the ability to stretch those funds further than we should reasonably expect them to. However, Mr. Speaker, neither the education authorities nor the principals can multiply bread and fish, so eventually, even their skill and dedication will not be enough to stave off the damage from never-ending budget cuts. A system can only bend so far before it breaks, and we're already starting to see stress fractures. Schools are increasingly having difficulty affording enough staff to provide the level of education that our students deserve, and are having to make cuts in areas that they know will directly affect educational outcomes. They have no choice, though, Mr. Speaker. If you don't have the money, you don't have the money. What worries me is that at some point, the people who've been holding everything together are going to get fed up and move on, and the students will suffer. I've raised these concerns with the department before, and they've been raised by those within the system for years. However, nothing ever seems to change. I've never really heard any complaints about the funding formula coming from Yellowknife, with the exception of junior kindergarten debates, and the capital seems to have excellent educational outcomes. If there's resistance to changing the formula because it works well for Yellowknife, then keep it the same for Yellowknife, but change it for the regional centres so that our youth are also provided with the best possible opportunities to achieve success. Mr. Speaker, it's time that the department responds to these growing concerns and develop a funding formula that works for all schools. I'll have questions for the Minister of Education at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member Statement. Member Ike Godani, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it has been 2.5 years since the implementation of the new airport improvement tax. MLAs were told that tax revenues would be used for capital improvements that would improve the customer experience. Now, during peak tourism season, is a good time to take a close look at the results. In March of 2017, the minister said that the new fee would support improvements at the airport to help, I quote, create benefits for all travelers, end quote. Specifically, the minister claimed that, again, quote, improve security services and expanded holding areas that reduce congestion, along with improved amenities, will improve traveler experience and comfort, end quote. Now, after millions of dollars collected in user fees and hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on renovations to the security screening area, the key complaint of constituents is that security line wait times are unreasonably long. Why? Because there's still only one security line at the airport. Shame. Mr. Speaker, one of the objectives of those renovations was to increase security screening throughput. But clearly, it doesn't seem like things have improved at all. In fact, some people believe the situation is much worse. So, what went wrong? Where is the new CATSA Plus screening equipment that was supposed to be included in the renovations? Airport management, during a presentation at City Hall, told Council that CATSA Plus would increase throughput by up to 60%. This system looks nothing like CATSA Plus system in other airports. Does the YZF management even track security line wait times? How do they expect to be able to manage the problem if they aren't measuring it? Mr. Speaker, stories of missed boardings and even entire missed trips have now become legendary on social media. When the process is so inept that people are missing flights or flights are being delayed, that's not an acceptable practice. Mr. Speaker, when the minister created the revolving fund and introduced the new tax, he chose not to go the full distance and establish an airport authority, which, as we've seen elsewhere, would have introduced a very business-like approach to managing the airport. Instead, he opted to maintain government control of the airport, but has it worked? An airport authority surely would have done something about an obvious problem like security wait times by now. I will have questions for the minister at the appropriate time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member Statement. Member Ike Godani, the member Cam Lake.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to bring further attention to an issue which affects Northerners of all ages and walks of life directly or indirectly, our mental health care system. I want to take a moment first to thank all in our communities, in the public and private healthcare facilities, the nurses, doctors, therapists, community leaders, specialists, and elders who work tirelessly for the betterment and health of all Northerners. We all owe you a great debt of gratitude. My thoughts today are being made in the hope we can improve the existing programs and the concerns that have been shared with me by Northerners about access to these crucial services. Depression, anxiety, PTSD, seasonal mood disorder, bipolar disorder, suicide, survivors of abuse, the list goes on. The people who live daily with these and many other afflictions are too often hiding in plain sight. They may have the biggest smiles and brightest of personalities, and yet just below the surface they may be facing thoughts, feelings, and emotions which are not in line with the outward image they portray. When Northerners decide they need help, they can call the N.W.T helpline, which is a good first point of access. But members of the public have brought it to my attention that under the current process, wait times are more commonly 6 to 12 weeks, or even months, a far cry from the 2 to 3 weeks as stated by the minister. In Hay River, I'm told it can take 8 months of waiting just to get an appointment to see a counselor for those without health insurance benefits or those who cannot afford to wait due to a mental health crisis. There's even less support, and paying out of pocket just isn't an affordable solution to those who need help the most. Now, let me be clear. I'm not talking about a two-tiered system. We're talking about those who fall through the cracks, those who need help now, and those who, if they wait for the prescribed length of time, risk falling back into addiction, self-harm, or worse. There's clearly a disconnect between what we are being told in this House and what the public is telling us at their doorstep. These wait times can have far-reaching consequences. We know that when people reach out for help, that being told to wait for months on end is just not an option. They are at high risk and are in need of compassion and a helping hand at that exact moment. We need a system of mental health care that makes best use of our resources and gets Northerners the help they need as soon as they need it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Goodin and the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to bring up the quality of health care we have in the N.W.T. My riding of the Mackenzie Delta has a high number of complaints regarding treatment received at the local health centres and also in Inuvik. Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents who call me say they go to the health centre because they are sick, they are in pain, they need medical attention, and on most cases, they are given Tylenol or other equal antibiotic for pain and sent home. Many of my constituents are continuing to have medical issues, and these medical issues can and will get more serious if not treated. I'm sure all our small communities can relate to this concern. Mr. Speaker, before our people suffer more than they already have, let's get answers to why many of our constituents are not being referred to doctors or hospitals for further examination. Mr. Speaker, my constituents are demanding a better quality of health care, and I'll have questions later today. Thank you.
Massey. Member statement. Member Ike Goodin and the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Our mining minister recently announced that the Mactung property in the Mackenzie Mountains is finally up for sale. Just how did we get here? North American Tungsten, the owner and operator of the former Cantong mine, went into creditor protection on June 9, 2015. Somehow the federal government let that company put up the Mactung property as part of its financial security for its water license. When our government inherited management of the Cantong site under devolution, nothing was done to change that arrangement, even though N.W.T had total discretion over the form of security that was held. So much for polluter pays and the devolution promise of responsible resource development. As part of the creditor protection proceeding, Cabinet ended up purchasing Mactung for $2.5 million with a special warrant that bypassed the Legislative Assembly. That way it could hand Cantong back to the federal government for remediation. When we acquired the Mactung property, a lot of junk and hazardous materials had been left behind at the site, even though I had been told that there was nothing there. A non-compliance letter was written by the Yukon government to N.W.T about Mactung on February the 4th, 2016. I kept pressing ministers to have an assessment done of the site. That was done, but the report has not been publicly released. N.W.T issued a contract for $87,000 to do a partial cleanup of the site in the summer of 2018. 2 reports of field observations and geology of the Mactung deposit and surrounding area were prepared at taxpayers' expense and released in January 2018. The minister promised to share the marketing plan with the Standing Committee for Mactung, but that hasn't happened. On December 20th, 2018, a Vancouver consultant submitted an application for a Class 4 quartz mining land use approval to the Yukon government for 10 years of exploration at Mactung, quote, as a part of a means of increasing the appeal on the Mactung property to prospective buyers, end of quote. Lots of questions and not a lot of clear communications. I'm sure the minister is looking forward to my questions later today. Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statement. Member from South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2019 Traditional Games Championship. Mr. Speaker, as you know, the Government of the Northwest Territories offers many diverse programs and services. Together, the departments, boards, and agencies take care of our infrastructure, deliver health care, maintain public housing, power our homes, and much more. These are big, important things. But the N.W.T also helps Northerners take care of the little things, and sometimes even these little things are valuable. I want to talk about one today. This past weekend, the 2019 Traditional Game Championship, sponsored and led by the staff of the Aboriginal Sports Circle, was held here in Yellowknife. Students from 22 schools, including Chief Titsili School in Fort Good Hope, the Cove Lake School, the Mackenzie Mountain School in Norman Wells, and the Etsaea School in Delaney, gathered to compete in traditional Dene and Inuit games. I'm glad these young people can gather to celebrate their culture together like this. This is great to see and witness. Mr. Speaker, being on the Standing Committee on Government Operations, the N.W.T supports for games like these are very important to me and my colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I would like to see this continued support success for games and for our non-government organizations or NGOs like the Aboriginal Sports Circle for continued success. Later I will have questions to the appropriate minister. Merci.
Merci. Member statement. Member YELLOWKNIFE, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, housing is an important issue in Yellowknife Centre, where so many of my constituents are renters. Affordability remains a major issue, with 1 in 7 households overspending on rent in the marketplace. Availability is also a significant problem for people who need rent geared to income. There are long waiting lists at the Yellowknife Housing Authority, Northern United Place, and Avens Court. With these facts in mind, I attended the announcement of the new federal territorial housing agreement in November with great anticipation. The agreement is worth $140 million over 10 years, with money beginning to flow in April. The agreement addresses the 3 elements of housing need: affordability, adequacy, and suitability. It identifies priority groups for social housing, including seniors, women and children fleeing violence, veterans, refugees, visible minorities, people suffering from mental illness, and those who are homeless. Mr. Speaker, the new agreement aims to increase the number of rent-assisted units by 15% beginning in 2020-21. And it aims to repair 20% of existing public housing units. This is good news, but I am disappointed there are no targets for new housing corporation construction, even though the strategy is supposed to expand housing stock. At a briefing to the Standing Committee on Social Development, the president of the N.W.T Housing Corporation confirmed that the corporation's rental inventory will stay at 2,400 units. However, there is $60 million available through a co-investment fund for nonprofits and others to build affordable housing. Mr. Speaker, regular MLAs are keenly interested in reducing housing need across the N.W.T. We passed a motion in 2016 that called on government to reduce core housing need by 2% a year for 4 years, so that the N.W.T met the national average by the end of our term. We will know later this year what progress government has made. The N.W.T Bureau of Statistics is conducting its every 5-year N.W.T community survey this winter. It will give us a snapshot of where we stand. In the meantime, the detail about how the money from the federal territorial agreement is going to be spent will be worked out in a 3-year action plan to be completed next month. This action plan represents a key milestone in meeting the needs of Northerners for more and better housing. I will have questions for the N.W.T. Minister responsible for the Housing Corporation. Merci.
Merci. Member statements. Member for Nanakwut.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Untitled Regional Corporation, through its Community Economic Development Organization, has been awarded a $500,000 prize by the Arctic Inspiration Prize Charitable Trust. Mr. Speaker, the project is a joint venture between the Untitled Regional Corporation and the Gwich'in Tribal Council and fully supported by the Aurora Research Institute. Mr. Speaker, the concept is to develop an innovative process to support Northern Indigenous artists and crafters in the Western Arctic. The team will engage with artisans in each community and create an association of Indigenous artists and crafters across the region to work at developing sustainable business ventures, improving their art skills, ensuring authentic, high-quality products, and building confidence as sustainable business owners. Mr. Speaker, the project will commence immediately and provide the business supports required to Number one, establish a sustainable association of working artists and crafters who will support each other and the arts craft sector by building a critical mass in each community. Number two, remove barriers to venture creation by hiring 2 business managers for the association to manage the books, provide business services and counseling, promote the artists, create an online presence for sales, and develop markets. Mr. Speaker, the project will also address long-standing challenges traditionally faced by Northern Indigenous artists, including, but not limited to, encouraging meaningful investment in artists and crafters, addressing policies that hinder venture creation, tweaking them to be more encouraging and supportive, building and maintaining the reputation for high-quality, authentic Northern Indigenous art, and developing young artists to ensure that the continuity of traditional knowledge in the art and culture. Mr. Speaker, the project team is a strong and collaborative partnership between the IRC, the GTC, and ARI that have the skills, expertise, resource, and passion required to move it from concept to successful completion and to inspire local artists, crafters, and the community members to embrace the vision and make the project their own. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate Traditional Techniques tweaked to inspire and galvanize Indigenous Northern artists on their win at the 2019 Arctic Inspiration Prize. Kuyanani, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Member statements. Member for Tunade Woladay.
Masicho, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, do it with Anizia Marmitlan Marl.
Mamena wala ukak week makitunga ulumi Eld and Marlo kawsakayang ini maligam alunga 1932 mit ana kawsakaya kay no law si mang malutso kemi 86 niya kago no nakalaw si mang mainulo ni Madeleine ino yun nilaw si mang man inatok awlaw to aniriyaw nilo amisuno kingo nakaknakayaw na to 7 nakitong akalaw to Frank, Angelina, Angie, Fred, Catherine, James, Richard.
17 grandchildren and countless other great-grandchildren, nephews, and nieces. Madeline is predeceased by her husband, Johnny Marlowe, and her 3 sons, Noel, Troy, and George Marlowe, and her granddaughter, Vanessa Marlowe. Ms. Speaker, among many stories of Madeline's life, there are 3 in particular that I'd like to share today. Firstly, in 2015, Madeline was among a group of 25 who received the Premier's Award for collaboration with respect to their work with the Hutsalket Dictionary Project. Another notable fact is that Madeline has a granddaughter, Tishna Marlowe, who is a fashion designer, and accredits Madeline's tremendously for her beading and sewing prowess. According to Tishna, she could not have achieve the success she's earned if it wasn't for Madeline's influence. Thirdly, Mr. Speaker, I also want to acknowledge the fact that Madeline Marlowe is a mother to my constituent assistant, James Marlowe. James has been a valuable and loyal member of my staff for many years. So to James, your family, I extend my condolences for your loss. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Our condolences to the family and to the community as well. Masi. Member statements. Member statements. Returns to oral questions. Returns to oral questions. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I'd like to recognize a page, Ashley Sisson-Carlson from Cam Lake, and all the pages who have been helping us for our sitting. Thank you very much for the work that you do. Thank you.
Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Hay River South.
I recognize my son CJ, and he's here with his friend Sarah, who is a dedicated Air Canada stewardess who helps move tourists all around the world that benefit residents of the Northwest Territory as well. So I want to welcome to the House. Thank you.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in gallery. Member for Range Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start with recognizing again my nephew, Jeremy Beauchamp. Looks like he might be trying to take my seat here in the House. Glad to have him. And then Susie Nepiak is the translator from in N.W.T, and she lives in my constituency, so I'm glad to see her. She also is a great writer of books with traditional knowledge from her culture, so a great asset to the Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Recognition of visitors in the gallery. Recognition of visitors in gallery. If we miss anyone in the gallery, thanks for being here with us. It's always great to have an audience as part of our proceedings. Acknowledgments. Acknowledgments. Oral questions. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today in my member statement I talked about the funding for the Divisional Education Authority and for the Decho, which has 8 communities. So my first question from the Minister of Education, Culture and Employment is, can the Minister please provide information on how the school funding framework works? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So how does the funding formula work right now? Right now we provide money for schools to be able to provide services for JK to grade 12. It does have a funding formula that we feel is equitable, but it does also permit flexibility for the local decision making that needs to be done by authorities. Some of that is being able to be flexible, such as our territorial school monies. We also provide administration monies, but some of it actually has been changed that it needs to be spent for things such as inclusive schooling and the Aboriginal languages. Those have to be spent on those areas specifically, but we try to be as flexible as possible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Oral question like Kida de Akasi member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I talked about the disparity between different regions here, and we talked about the Sawtoo has 5 communities, 4 communities. Is it 4? 5 communities. Sorry, and 4 staff. And in my riding, we have 8 communities, including the Decho riding, and we only have 2 staff. So can the Minister explain, if all education bodies are provided with funding on an equitable basis, why are there different staffing levels at different divisional education councils? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Masi. Minister of Education, Culture and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, like stated earlier, the funding formula is based on so that it's equitable. It's there is money for administration, etc. But there's also money that's provided for the number of children in the schools. However, they are allowed to use that with some flexibility, and therefore some schools do decide to use to hire additional teachers. Other schools decide to use it for other areas. And there's also other monies besides that comes from the GNWT. A lot of the schools in the territories have access to our Canada's Jordan's Principle, which is providing additional monies for them. We need to get more schools to work with this, to work on this area. So when we allow flexibility and when they can apply for outside sources of funding, that allows them the discretion to be able to hire additional teachers or not. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I talk about the differences in funding formula and that, and we're seeing a decline in our student population in the riding here. See, we lost 60 students this next coming year, so we're seeing a huger cutback on positions and that. So, can the minister please provide what process is used to change the school funding framework? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the funding formula is reviewed on a regular basis. We try to work with our school authorities to make school bodies to make sure that it meets their needs as well. In saying that, though, some things are addressed as the needs come up. For example, when I was brought to my attention just after I assumed this position as Education, Culture, and Employment Minister, when it was brought to my attention by the MLA from Nahande, that stated that we only had one teacher in small schools. That was an area of concern for me, and so I moved on that quite quickly to actually make sure that we have a minimum of 2 teachers in every single school in the Northwest Territories. So it's reviewed regularly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Council Member Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for her answers to this point here. I guess my concern, though, is when we talk about our divisional boards, when we only have 2 staff, we're going to burn those people out. They're going to be, working really hard, and when you got 8 schools, and it's very difficult for 2 people. They're always going to be on the road, so it is a concern. And when we don't even have the proper IT staff, that is a concern. So, will the minister make a commitment to do a cross-jurisdictional review of the funding formula? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a concern when we don't have enough teachers in schools, and that's why, like I said earlier, that I insisted that there be 2 teachers in every school. Some of our small schools, like the one I met with today, actually only has 5 students in it and now has 2 teachers in it. So we have to also be careful that we don't overload it so that we have more teachers than actual students at a time. In saying that, though, we do need to review the funding formula. When I was in the constituency tour for Nahande, it was brought to my attention that other jurisdictions actually don't do the funding based on the same way that we do within the Northwest Territories. That was really interesting to learn. And so it taught me that this isn't a Canada-wide funding formula and that we need to review it. So I have committed to the MLA, and I will continue to do that, is that we are looking at a cross-jurisdictional review within the next year to see what other provinces and territories are doing and to make sure we're as fair as possible to our students in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, constituents and other members of the public have brought to me their concerns around wait times of 6 to 12 weeks to access mental health services, far greater than the government's own estimate of 2 to 3 weeks. Can the Minister of Health and Social Services respond to these concerns today with an updated and current estimate of the approximate wait times to access mental health care services in the Northwest Territories? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 things. Number 1, for issues that are critical or urgent, there really are no wait times. We triage these individuals right away, and if the triage identifies it as being an urgent or a critical issue, they will see somebody right away. However, the member is correct. There are wait times for non-urgent counseling services here in the Northwest Territories, and some of them are quite long. Yellowknife, for adults, it's up to 3 months. For children, 2 months. In Betchico, it's anywhere from 4 to 5 weeks wait time for non-urgent counseling services. In Hay River, it's actually the worst in the territories at about 35 weeks. I know the member has raised a number of questions on that. We're trying to find some solutions there. And in Fort Smith, it's 1 to 2 weeks. In the smaller communities, we tend not to have the same kind of wait list. Typically, there are times when we may have a vacancy or someone goes on holiday that there might be a short-term wait list, but typically not in the smaller communities. But I do hear the member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nakita Council Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, those are, a non-urgent issue can become an urgent issue if it's not addressed. And waiting 8 months, I think, is a pretty significant wait time for people who are looking for that kind of care. The minister mentioned urgent or critical cases. Can he share the policy that governs a critical or urgent case? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I believe I heard the member correctly when he indicated 8-month wait times. And if the member is aware of somebody who's waiting 8 months, we're trying to constantly improve. And I would strongly encourage the member to seek consent from that individual so that they can approach us so we can find out what's going on in that particular file. Because on average, 3 months in Yellowknife is what we're seeing for non-urgent issues. Mr. Speaker, all community counseling programs with wait times or wait lists have an intervention plan in place to ensure that urgent clients do not slip through the cracks. And this recognizes that individuals may change over the time that they're waiting. They may come in, they may not be deemed urgent, but it may escalate as a result of changing situations. So as a result of these plans, triaging of all clients on referral and prioritizing urgent clients. We're offering same-day counseling to individuals who are identified as urgent, and when possible, short-term workshops and other things are done in the community to give our residents options. If an individual is on the wait list and they're told your appointment's going to be in 6 weeks and there's a change in their situation, they should immediately reach out to their health and social services providers who can do a new updated assessment to determine urgency, and if appropriate, they can take advantage of these services. But once again, if the member is aware of somebody that's 8 months, please reach out to them and encourage them to either talk to Quality Assurance or get consent for the member so that we can look into this file to figure out what went wrong. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Tadada Council Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So in the event that there's someone who's on the edge, but it's put on one of those queues, but feels they need the treatment and they seek their own, under their own initiative to go and obtain treatment, does the government have any policies to assist those people with any financial costs incurred if their case would have fallen under the health care and they simply could not wait in the queue any longer? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, all the programs and services, counseling, treatment services that we provide are based on a referral. They would need a referral for us to provide them with financial supports and coverage. Many insurance providers don't need our same level of referral. I mean, they could always approach their own insurance provider if they have it, recognizing that not everybody has it. But typically, no, if someone seeks treatment outside of our system, we wouldn't cover their costs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nundere Council Member Kamlik.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So recently the minister spoke of new on-the-land healing programs that would address some of this backlog by providing more local options. There's around $5 million from the federal government to support this. This government itself has been budgeting $1.23 million for several years now. So with the 8 contribution agreements that have been signed that the minister spoke of recently in the House, how has that money, how many programs, like real actual programs that people can access to get these kind of services and avoid wait lists, has this money created? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I know the member's aware, but just before I answer the on-the-line question, we're doing a number of things to try and help us control and reduce the wait times. One of the things we're doing is actually providing child and youth counselors across the territories, which is open up a service that really doesn't exist for many of our youth today who are using the system as a whole. So this will also, we're putting more positions and we're trying to create more resources for people. Mr. Speaker, we have $1.23 million, the $5 million that the member is referring to, I think, and I think he may be referring to the wellness money that flows through the federal government, through us, to the Indigenous governments. They get to choose how to spend those dollars. We don't dictate how they spend those dollars. We have $1.23 million available for on-the-land programming. We make $125,000 available to each of the Indigenous governments. They can ask for more, up to $30,000 on a case-by-case basis. Right now, we have a number of individual Indigenous governments who are running the programs. I could go through the list, but I think it might just be easier to provide the member that information in writing because it is quite detailed. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikadekan, the member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have some follow-up questions to my earlier statement about the funding framework used by Education, Culture and Employment to fund education councils around the region. The MLA for Nahende had some questions earlier, and in those answers from the minister noted that the framework is undergoing review right now. There's a cross-jurisdictional scan. And so could the minister please clarify if this is a full review or if it is just a jurisdictional scan? And if it's a review, what is the scope of this review, and how is the department accounting for the uniqueness of the Northwest Territories in terms of remoteness, in terms of difficulty attracting staff and factors such as that? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. There are several questions in there. Minister of Education, Culture, Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad you noted that because I was going, there must be at least 10 questions in that one statement. So I'm going to try to pick one of them out of there, and then he can slam me with the other ones. The member had stated that we're currently undergoing this review. That is not correct. We are in the process of just looking at it. I had just returned from the Nahende and realized that other jurisdictions have different funding formulas, and therefore I've made a commitment that we will begin the work towards looking at how other jurisdictions provide their funding to their school bodies. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, member Nakita Deakasi, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's unfortunate that they're thinking about beginning the work to look at a possible review. I was hoping there was a little more going on than this. Perhaps the minister can elaborate on how they assess the quality of the current funding formula. I think by the department's own admission, just because you're funded to the formula doesn't mean you're funded adequately. So how does the department assess the adequacy of the funding formula? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health, Minister of Education, Culture, Employment.
I could try.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the last comprehensive review actually on the funding formula was done in March 2016, where a number of things were brought up. And like I said, I mean, we're constantly reviewing it, so it's something that always is on the template. Some of the things that we did notice and that were changed from that review, though, were for example, things like targeted funding, such as inclusive schooling. We had given too much, in my opinion, too much discretion to the education bodies, and some were using it for teachers, some were using it for all kinds of things. So we tightened up the inclusive schooling funding so that they had to use it for defined purposes, because we always say in the House we don't have enough for inclusive schooling, so we have to make sure that we provide it where it's supposed to go. Another thing that was brought to the attention was the money for Indigenous Aboriginal languages, Indigenous languages. That has to go to Indigenous languages, so we tighten that up as well. A third factor that I found from that review was actually that a lot of the education bodies, I hear all the time that there's not enough money, we need more money, we need more money, but I was shocked when I heard that education bodies had surpluses funding. And I'm going, how do people who need money have surpluses? So we tightened that up as well, Mr. Speaker, and said, spend it or lose it. So, you know, we gave them a certain amount to be able to keep for surplus, because surplus is good. But the rest of it needs to go back into schooling. If we need more schooling, more money for students, then we need to use the money we have on the plate at the moment. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Deakasi, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The minister, in my statement, I said that the funding formula is too rigid, and the minister said, well, we looked at the funding formula and we made it more rigid. Those are the kind of changes we're making. And then she talked about the surplus, how she said, well, the schools have too much surplus. The schools have too much surplus. in her opinion, because the funding formula doesn't work, and so they need this money to accommodate things that aren't accommodated in the funding formula. I think that there's a complete disconnect between the department and what's going on the ground, the actual needs of the schools. So the minister talked about some of the detrimental changes that have been made that came out of the last review. Are they looking at making any changes today or currently? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is kind of a sin to hear that schools feel threatened, that they feel they got to hold on to their money and have a surplus to meet their needs. My background was in the NGO world, and surpluses was a luxury that we never actually got to use, and if we seen it, we spent it as soon as we got it. So I really want education bodies to know that use your money. We're not going to dry up. We're still going to provide funding. Some of the work that's going on right now is I meet with the education bodies a couple of times a year. I brought forward to them that, because when I've gone to those meetings, they've all been very politically correct. And sometimes for me, politically correct doesn't always mean it's the right thing to do. So I put it on the table and said the next meeting that we have with the education bodies, I want to talk about inclusive schooling. I want to hear from them firsthand what their issues, what the strengths and what the issues are. And so then we can actually determine how we use that money better. If I don't hear, it's one thing to hear in the House, but if the education bodies don't bring those needs to my attention, then it doesn't say it's an issue. I need to hear from those designated authorities that tell me these are concerns and what we would like to see as solutions. So that is one change I'm making, is to try to open up the communications. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Nundere Cassie, member Hay River North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That makes two ministers who say that if they hear something in the House, it's not a concern. They need to hear it from the people directly. I'm not sure what they think our job is as elected officials, but to be voices for the people. And I got to say, I'm glad to hear that the minister is going to sit down with the authorities and actually listen to them. Because this question was going to be, what happens to all those conversations that are had? Because I hear about the conversations from the authorities, and then they seem to just go into a drawer, the drawer is closed, and they're never seen again. So what is going to come out of these conversations with the authorities? Can I get something that a deliverable from the conversations that the minister is going to have? What is she going to do with that information? I need something concrete. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Education, Culture, and Employment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I apologize if I was incorrect, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't believe that I had said that MLAs don't speak for the people. They do speak for the people. But I also need to hear directly from the education bodies. They are the people they're my partners. I fund them. They are responsible for providing services to the students. So I need to make sure that relationship, the minister before me worked hard on developing relationships. I need to carry that forward. We need to get it to a place where they actually feel comfortable to come to me as the minister and say, we have concerns. And like I've done with other groups, Mr. Speaker, it's not about just hearing and ignoring. It's about talk about the issues, talk about solutions, and then find solutions that meet the needs of all of us. And that's what I have done all my life in my career as a social worker, and that's what I can commit to continuing to do, is looking for solutions that work for all partners involved, including the children. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Ikeda County, the member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement today, I spoke about the continuing lineups and long waits at the Yellowknife Airport. Mr. Speaker, in an effort to provide the airport, to promote the airport improvement fee, the minister said before the renovation began that the improvements would improve the experience of the traveling public and reduce waiting times. But today there's still only one lineup, and the travelers are all forced to go through this bottleneck. I'd like to ask the minister that after $300,000 in renovations, can the minister explain how this is an improvement? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I can certainly tell you about all the improvements we've done out there with the revolving fund. Probably one of the best things this Assembly's done to help improve tourism, particularly in Yellowknife. We spent a lot of money out there improving the system. The members raised the question around the CATSA Plus system. And let's make it quite clear in this House, I am not in charge of CATSA Plus. That's a federal initiative, that's their responsibility, but we are working very closely with them to improve the visitors and the traveling public's experience. Now, I got a bunch of notes here that I can clearly go to, but I want to make it quite clear that, you know, I've traveled as much as anybody in this Legislative Assembly. And there's times I've been out there that I've been out there and I've been frustrated myself. There's a number of issues around the security wait times. Sometimes it's too many flights all at once. Sometimes it's staffing shortages at CATSA Plus. That's probably the biggest concern right now with the CATSA system is the shortage of employees and the amount of training that needs to be taking place out there. But we have been tracking the CATSA Plus system and along with our improvements that we've done out at the Yellowknife Airport, and we've been tracking it, and it's been down by 30% on average of wait times. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question na Kidade, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, thank you to the Minister for his reply, but I don't think that the public is going to find that to be too satisfactory because, in fact, the Minister's staff in a previous briefing to Yellowknife City Council actually indicated and referred to specifically that the installation of a CATSA Plus screening system would increase throughput of passengers. So do we have a CATSA Plus system, and if not, why not? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can assure the member the system that is out there at the airport is the new CATSA Plus system. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Tadade, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it would be appreciated if the Minister could share some information with, at least with the department, or sorry, with the committee, the Standing Committee on Economic Development and Environment about what a CATSA Plus system entails so that we can get more information. But, Mr. Speaker, at the same briefing, the Minister's staff told Council to expect a 60% increase in throughput with this new system. Now the Minister has said that it's 30%. Can the Minister at least describe to us how they measure it, and are they in fact measuring the throughput? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I did say that it's resulted in a 30% increase. We're working to improve it even more, even though I say it's not our system. We are working with the CATSA Plus people to make improvements out there. The security staff right now is actually doing the monitoring and tracking of the wait times, but we are moving to put in an automated system out at the airport for both security queue times, and also we're going to be looking at the luggage wait time. So that's an improvement that through the revolving fund that we're also going to be able to track these things and have better data for all the residents of the Northwest Territories. But as I've said, the biggest problem we have out there right now with that system is staffing issues. It's not the system, it's not the new configuration that we've put into place, it's the CATSA staffing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundede, Cassie, member Yellowknife North.
Mr. Speaker, while I appreciate the Minister's reply as it relates to staffing issues, I mean, that's a concern that we all have here in the North, staffing issues. But the fact of the matter is that there's still only one lineup. The staff there, quite frankly, in my view and others, is they're doing a commendable job. It's just you can't increase the throughput without having more screening systems. So I'd like to ask the Minister, is this it? After $300,000 and all these improvement fees, is this as good as it gets? Or are we going to see a much improved system? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Infrastructure.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. He's kind of left an open-ended question there for me, so I'm going to take the opportunity to say, you know, the revolving fund has given us an opportunity at the Yellowknife Airport to do a number of improvements. It's not just the CATSA system. That's a system that we're working on. We're working at something that's not even in my control. We're working with the federal government to try to improve it. We've went and done other steps outside of what I've just said about the new configuration and the staffing issues. We've put up, for those of you in the House that have traveled lately, we've put up signage in Asian languages to help wayfinding systems there to help people prior to going into the CATSA system to get the be a little bit more prepared to when they're traveling. There's videos out there in different languages outside the security system to also educate passengers. So we're doing a lot of different things of improving the Yellowknife Airport, not just the CATSA system. There's the runways and all these other things that we're spending this money on. But as I said here probably a couple weeks ago in my minister's statement in the House, you know, we're the victim of our own success again. Landings are up 15%. Traffic by passengers is up by 4%. We've put in these new systems and we're trying to accommodate the people the best we can. And my best recommendations to the traveling public is, you know, we're so used to being such a small jurisdiction that we can go to the airport and jump on a plane 10 minutes before it goes. But the reality of it is in the Yellowknife Airport, you got to start looking at going out there 90 minutes to 60 minutes prior to the party. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Earlier today, I reviewed the history of our government's acquisition and management of the Mactung property. We accepted it as financial security against the shaky Cantong mine, have spent money cleaning up the site, compiling geological reports and so on, in the hope of finally trying to sell it. Can the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment tell us how much has been spent to assess and clean up the site, compile geological reports, hire a consultant to file Yukon government applications, and now market it? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And this is a detailed question, and I got to commend the member for giving me the questions ahead of time because we had to compile a lot of information on this set of questions. So I'll go through the members' list. The government has spent $126,025 removing hazardous and other materials from the site. There's been no assessment of full remediation costs, as this is not work that we are intending and undertaking. We have completed Mactung site visits, one by lands, other resulting in 2 geological reports on the mine site and surrounding area, but no formal site assessment has been completed. This work was completed by the Northwest Territories Geological Survey at a cost of approximately $30,000 and was aided by helicopter support from the federal government's Polar Continental Shelf program. The government of Northwest Territories has spent $16,304 for the preparation and submission of the Class 4 Quartz Mining Land Use Permit application and has engaged Tetra Tech as our consultant for this renewal. A local company was engaged in the renewal of licenses, and we are currently working on a budget for the sale process. Those numbers have not been yet finalized. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the Kitadaya member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister for that detailed response, and I'll certainly check Hansard to review that. It's not clear why the Minister is marketing the Mactung property in conjunction with the federal government efforts underway to sell Cantong. These two properties are 140 kilometers away from each other by air and 700 kilometers by road. Can the Minister explain why we are marketing these properties together, and if they are for sale separately, what is the asking price for Mactung? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, selling the Mactung deposit together with the Cantong mine will increase the potential viability of the renewed mining operations. That said, we're looking to get more than just a cash payment or a return on the baseline. We're looking to capitalize on the rise of the tungsten prices to translate these world-class resources into good-paying jobs. We believe there's an opportunity for these two projects to create a future Northwest Territories tungsten industry. Selling them together will give us the best possible option, shortest time frame to converting these assets into a working project that will deliver benefits to the residents and businesses of the Northwest Territories. And we also don't want these two assets to compete against each other in what is a relatively small global market of producers and buyers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadadea, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I would like to thank the Minister again for that answer, but he didn't answer one of my questions, which was how much is the price for the Mactung property? Can the Minister tell us that? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, this is early in the process. We don't have a specific price for this. We want to sell these properties together. It will be an open bidding process with an evaluation that brings best benefits to the residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. No dere Cassie member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Thanks to the Minister for that. So the Minister has hired a Vancouver consultant to help hype the Mactung property by applying for a 10-year Government of Yukon quartz mining land use approval. Such an authorization is supposed to be for an actual exploration program, although it is my understanding that there is no exploration to be undertaken by our government. So the application seems to be an unusual attempt at best to inflate the value of the property. Can the Minister tell us whether there are any precedents in the Yukon for such a speculative land use application, and whether he got any legal advice on the validity of such an application? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, that would be a lead story, but the member is mischaracterizing what's going on here. The Government of Northwest Territories has required to renew the mining land use permit on the Yukon side of this property in order to keep the property in good standing. If we don't renew it, if we don't renew the permit, it's likely that a full site remediation would be ordered and all the potential benefits would be lost. In addition, the potential purchaser requires the ability to conduct exploration work as part of its due diligence process, and this is how a buyer confirms a mineral resource, and is also a consideration of arranging purchase and financing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my questions are for the Minister of Northwest Territories and Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. Mr. Speaker, with the most recent blizzard in Paulatuck with winds as high as 140 kilometers an hour, one roof blew apart, which is one of the newer buildings in the community. Mr. Speaker, I'm worried the type of construction in the high Arctic communities, the design for a building will not withstand the winter storms. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister improve the design and quality of homes that are being built in the Arctic, and especially in Nunavut, where winter storms are occurring more often? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the roof was designed to withstand the strong winds. Obviously, the damage was unexpected. We'll continue to work with the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, as well as leadership in the communities, as you've heard me say many times in this House, as we develop our community housing plans to address some of these priorities. As we're seeing weather that continues to happen, especially community of Paulatuck. I know we had a very strong storm there last year. So obviously the roof was designed to withstand the strong winds. Very unexpected, but we will work on continuing to address these kind of concerns as they move forward, not only in Paulatuck, but with all of our communities across the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Council Member N.W.T.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's good to see that the Minister is recognizing the harsh winds we have up north. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Housing announced that there will be a community housing there will be community housing planning events. There is one scheduled for Paulatuck. Mr. Speaker, can the Minister give an update on what this meeting will consist of and what benefits will it bring to the community, not just the community of Paulatuck, but the region and Nunavut? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As members know, I did make a statement in this House about our community housing plans last week that prompted questions from other MLAs on how we're going to move about that and the 5 stages that we are going to take. Obviously, we do need buy-in from leadership and community members. We need to raise awareness in the community and have people speak up about what the priorities are in their community as we build these community housing plans. In my statement that I made last week, we are currently working on 6 communities. We've signed agreements with 3 of them. We're working to sign agreements with the other 3. And as we get our staff to get out and have these discussions and get that community input on what they see that is needed in their communities, then we'll get our staff out as as much as we can. I know they're listening right now, and I know they've been on the road quite a bit, not only discussing community plans, but looking at addressing homelessness and other initiatives that we're doing within the department. But as soon as we get the communities on the list, we'll try to get to them as soon as we can. But obviously, it's going to take community buy-in and leadership and continue those discussions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Council Member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response from the Minister. Sounds like there's a start to some commitment there. Mr. Speaker, talking about agreements with territorial governments and between the N.W.T and the IRC, Mr. Speaker, it's been proven to be a successful start in planning for the region. Mr. Speaker, as we move towards the end of this Assembly, will the Minister continue to improve upon the partnership between the IRC and the N.W.T to ensure that the number and quality of homes in Nunavut increase with the rising population? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, not only the IRC, but all of our Indigenous governments. We have been meeting a lot since I've taken on the portfolio and building on the success and hard work that the previous ministers have done. And we are working to continue to get all of our programs out to the communities. Obviously, with new leadership and new elections, we need to update our leadership on the programs that N.W.T Housing Corp provides, such as the Community Housing Support Initiative. We've made that announcement on the Co-Investment Fund. The bilateral agreements is going to have an impact throughout the Northwest Territories, which really prompted something new that hasn't been done before, and we're going to be looking at doing an Indigenous Housing Summit, which we're actually looking at trying to maybe possibly create a Northern Housing Summit that we're going to have all of our partners, all of our communities participate in, but also invite other jurisdictions such as the Yukon and Nunavut to attend. And we'll continue that strong partnership with the IRC and continue working with them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Council Member Nanakput.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the response. Mr. Speaker, it's good to see that the Housing Corporation is developing some programs that will involve not just the territory, but also other our sister territories across the north. Mr. Speaker, lately there have been some really pressing housing issues in my region. I commend the Housing Minister and his staff for the hard work that they do to start to put people in homes. Mr. Speaker, as you develop policy, Mr. Speaker, my question is to the ministers, will the minister involve Northern MLAs and Indigenous MLAs who represent Indigenous groups in their ridings to be involved in developing policy together so that we have continuity? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Minister of N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I've also mentioned in the House that we are going through a strategic renewal process within the N.W.T Housing Corporation that we should be looking at presenting to a standing committee. And obviously, we'd always want input on that as MLAs. That's part of our job is working on direction of legislation and policies, but also including our leadership in that. I mean, one of the big things about the community housing plans is that we want community and local input into what is best for them, and it's going to be something that's going to be done throughout all the communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, follow up to my member statement. I have a few questions for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, my constituents are demanding better quality health care, and I'd like to ask the Minister, will the quality of health care improve once the new Stanton Hospital is completed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's lots of things that are happening in the health and social services system with a focus on improving the delivery to all residents. Moving to a single authority has given us many opportunities, and the construction of the new Stanton building it will certainly help us provide efficient services in that building. But more importantly, for residents outside of Yellowknife, residents of the members' constituents, I think one of the most important things that we're doing right now is the Cultural Safety Action Plan, which is going to help ensure that our frontline people are trained and understand the environments in which they work. With that cultural safety action plan is also primary health care reform, and honestly, in my opinion, the primary health care reform is really the steps that are going to help us improve delivery at the front line for all residents of the Northwest Territories, including residents of his riding. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, the Kidder, Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when will my constituents be provided the best quality of health care and receive thorough examinations when needed? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, it's a very broad question. We know that in the Northwest Territories we do have some pretty great staff out there providing services, and many of our residents are getting timely and good care. But there are certainly residents who are raising issues, and it's important for us to learn from those issues. So I would strongly encourage the member, and all members in fact, if they have a resident who has an issue with the care that they've received, please bring it forward to our quality assurance professionals so that they can review those situations and make recommendations to help us ensure that some of those unfortunate situations are not occurring on a regular basis. We want to have a system that's constantly evolving, improving, and growing to meet our clients' needs, but we need our residents to be part of that process as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tada Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my constituents do bring up these issues, but this is an ongoing issue. Many times constituents go for checkups, you know, they have an illness that needs attention, but basically given Tylenol and being sent home, and that needs to stop, Mr. Speaker. Is our quality of health care being limited to save money on medical travel, as most high-quality examinations like MRIs, CT scans are done in Edmonton? So is that being limited to save on medical costs? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
No, Mr. Speaker.
Oral question, Nundere Cassie member Mackenzie Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can residents also travel to Vancouver for medical travel, or does everyone have to go to Edmonton when traveling outside the Northwest Territories? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Health and Social Service.
Mr. Speaker, under medical travel, you're referred to the location within our system that has the services available closest. So for some individuals, they would come into Inuvik. For some individuals, they might come into Hay River. For some individuals, they would come into Yellowknife. For things like MRIs and many of our specialist appointments or surgeries, our relationship is with Alberta. So our referral pattern is into Alberta. We are working with a couple of our communities in the Decho to create a relationship with Northern BC. But for the most part, all of our referrals are to our partners in Alberta. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Cannon, the member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in my member statement, I spoke about the new bilateral agreement on housing announced in November, and today I have some questions for the minister responsible for the Housing Corporation. One of the goals of the federal strategy for housing is to expand the stock of rent-assisted housing by 15%. Does that mean the number of special housing units in the N.W.T will increase by 15% to 2,760? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, under our current agreement with the federal government, the N.W.T needs to ensure that we preserve at least 1,231 existing community housing units across the Northwest Territories. Currently, we double that. I know that there are concerns about waiting lists, and that the new national housing strategy only provides funding to temporarily address the declining federal support for public housing units. One solution that we are looking at in addressing this, Mr. Speaker, and to all members, is that we do have this home ownership program, and once we get people into the home ownership program, then we can start increasing our stock, but also looking at private investment through the current co-investment fund that we did make an announcement on. So if we can start developing those partnerships and working with some of our private industry and getting people into home ownership, then we can start increasing our public housing units across the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question na Kidade, Cassie member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the minister himself has said that having people in public housing turn into property owners has been a challenge, even with various incentives and training programs. So what is the rest of the plan to expand the housing stock, given that the uptake on home ownership has been low? Thank you.
Merci. Minister of the N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Ms. Speaker. Ms. Speaker, as the member had mentioned in her statement, that we are working on finalizing a 3-year action plan. We are going to be working with communities. The home ownership program, we're going to try to get into each of our districts, across 5 districts across the Northwest Territories. We're also doing a lease home ownership program as well, lease to own program, that anybody that's in good standing with the housing corporation, then we can work with them to start leasing to own their housing unit. All these programs that we're working on is going to hopefully open up opportunities to start creating new housing units. We're also looking at a disposable program where we're disposing 50 units a year as our goal. That'll open up lots so we can start building new improved energy efficient units that are going to add to the stock. We have a lot of programs that we are working on, and with this 3-year action plan for the investment of the National Housing Strategy, I think it's going to have an impact throughout our communities across the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Tadade, Cassie member Yellowknife Centre.
Merci, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, can the minister assure members on this side that all of these initiatives that he has enumerated will result in a 15% increase in the number of available units across the N.W.T? Merci.
Merci. Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Ms. Speaker. And I think it's a responsibility not only for the N.W.T. Housing Corporation, our government, but my discussions with Indigenous governments as well as non-government organizations is that we all got to play a part in this. We all got to bring some type of responsibility, bring some skin to the game so that we can address housing needs across the Northwest Territories. I do know there's a high waiting list, especially here in Yellowknife and the regional centers. We're continuing to put pressure on the federal government. One thing that I didn't make comments to is that we're still looking for Indigenous housing funding. We do have a good program with the Inuvialuit Regional Corporation, but we're trying to bring a stronger voice with all leadership across the Northwest Territories. And I can assure members that we will be making an impact in housing across the Northwest Territories with all of these programs and continued funding from our partnerships with the federal government and Indigenous partners moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nundere Cassie member Yellowknife Centre.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've heard from this government before, we all have a role to play. But the fact is, we're talking about people who have very low income, people who have finished their work lives and are now seniors, people who are disabled who are looking for housing. I don't understand what role they are expected to play in creating new housing stock. I feel that the minister is hiding behind the CMHC declining funding. That funding is not going to decline for another 10 years. So why is the minister pointing to declining CMHC funding as a reason not to increase the housing stock? Merci.
Minister of N.W.T. Housing Corporation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in the agreement with the federal government, we have to ensure that we preserve at least 1,231 existing units. We doubled that already, Mr. Speaker. We've worked hard to get this bilateral agreement done with the federal government. That gives us the flexibility to do some really good work here in the Northwest Territories. We've carved out some extra funding for the co-investment fund. We're continuing to speak with the federal government on Indigenous housing funding and seeing how we can get more funding moving forward. In terms of the seniors, we're going to have that study. We're going to present that to committee tomorrow, actually. And then also we have met with the Disability Council and have invited them to this Northern Housing Summit that we're looking at doing to promote accessibility for people throughout the Northwest Territories as we look at building new stock or how we address disabilities, people living with disabilities in our housing units. So we are working very hard to address the concerns that members have brought up and assure members that we will see some positive results moving forward. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, you can add the member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Carrying on to my questions to the Minister of MAC on sports. My first question, Mr. Speaker, the Traditional Games Championship is led by the Aboriginal Sports Circle, N.W.T. How does MACA support this organization? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I want to commend all the coaches, the teachers, volunteers, Aboriginal Sports Circle, as well as staff from Municipal Community Affairs who put on a very successful Traditional Games this weekend. We have a strong partnership, a strong tradition of working with the Aboriginal Sports Circle. I do want to let all members know that at my Ministers of Sports meeting, we did promote our Traditional Games. I have invited the National Aboriginal Sports Circle representatives to come up to the Northwest Territories, as well as our minister responsible for sport, to look at how we incorporate sport and culture together in our traditions. So we do have a strong partnership with the Aboriginal Sports Circle in terms of the delivery of the Traditional Games. We do fund them up to about $125,000. Moving forward, other games that we in this budget have dollars allocated for multi-sports games as well. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Akira Cassie, member South 2.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks to the Minister for that reply. It was really encouraging when I witnessed the opening ceremony here this past Thursday in one of the schools here, the McDonald School, I believe it was. But it was really inspiring to see children from all of the communities, the remote communities, coming into the capital. Just the excitement of coming into the capital and being able to go to McDonald's is a privilege. So that bonding is taken back home through the games, and I really commend the minister in supporting the continuation of the social foundation. My next question is, what else does MACA do in supporting Traditional Games events like this championship? Thank you.
William McDonald School, that is. Minister of Municipal Community Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we do continue to support Traditional Games, whether they're held here in Yellowknife, the annual games that allow all schools to submit a team. And the great thing about that is you have 4 males and 4 female representatives, so everyone gets to participate, and that's really great to see, and that Aboriginal Sports Circle does offer, and MACA offers support to get students and their coaches here. We do also provide about $50,000 to the Aboriginal Sports Circle so that they can get out to the communities and promote Traditional Games in the communities where a lot of the students or youth might not be able to come to Yellowknife. So that's one thing that they're doing, and we support that and promote it. As I mentioned, when we did speak at our Minister of Sports meeting, one thing that we did promote from myself was increased funding from the federal government for all games, whether it's Arctic Winter Games, Canada Winter Games, Summer Games, Winter Games, Westerns, and then As I mentioned, we invited our leadership to come up and see how successful and how great we do in promoting our traditional games here in the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Tadade Kiasi, member Satu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is more of a comment here. I look forward to working with the Minister as we go through the budget deliberations on funding allocation to support this foundation. Merci.
Merci. Comment to the executive. Member statement. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I'd like to follow up with the Minister of Industry, Tourism and Trade, or Investment, sorry. I'd like to, I think I heard him say earlier today in response to one of my questions that our government has simply applied to the Yukon government for a renewal of a land use approval that's already in existence. So I did check the land use approval that we had with the government of the Yukon. It's LQ00253B. And it ran from February the 4th, 2016 to December 21st, 2018. So it's actually expired. Can the minister tell us, again, has our government actually applied for a renewal or a new permit for the work that is to take place at the Mactung site? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I assume the member's talking about the quartz mining land use approval process in the Yukon, if I'm correct. No? Yes. So that's been in place for a long time. That permit is that exact permit has been in place since 2014, Mr. Speaker, and before that it's been in place since 2009. As I said, this renewal is required for the Government of Northwest Territories to maintain the site and have access to the claims and the leases for any type of activity. So this is important for us to renew this thing, and it's also from a buyer's perspective, there needs to be this in place so they can go on the ground and do their due diligence if they're interested in buying this piece of property and help support any potential purchaser financing needs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question, Nakita Kasi, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. And I did check, I want to thank the Minister for that. I did check the permit application, or sorry, the Yukon Quartz Mining Land Use Approval application that was submitted on behalf of our government by Tetra Tech. And there's a box in here that says that it's actually a new permit that's being applied for. So I'll share that with the Minister. But and I want to quote from the supporting package. It says, quote, "There's currently no formal plan to carry out the activities proposed. N.W.T is seeking a quartz mining land use approval in part as a means of increasing the appeal of the Mactung property to prospective buyers," end of quote. So can the Minister tell us, is it the intention of our government to actually carry out any exploration, or is this really a play to try to hype up the value of the property? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
I'd like to remind members that that information is not readily available for a minister to view. If you can reiterate your question to the minister. Member for Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I understand that the application that our government submitted, I'd like to know from the minister, is it the intention of our government to actually carry out any exploration work at the the Mactung property? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Mr. Speaker, as I said, this renewal is required by our government to maintain the site. We have to have access to our claims and our leases for any type of activity there. The permit includes approvals for more than just exploration. It covers monitoring activities, remediation, ongoing cleanup, like the work that we did last year at site. And the value is needed for us to keep this permit in place. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Tata Dayakasi, member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. It's my understanding through media reports that the Yukon Conservation Society has raised concerns about the speculative nature of this land use approval application. So can the minister confirm whether this is being done to increase the value of the property? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I've clearly said in this House already a number of times today, this is clearly a necessity for us to be able to continue with our permitting process for this property. And if we do not renew this mining court's land use approval, the Yukon government can tell us to remediate this site, and that is not going to add value to us trying to sell this site and do what we're trying to do for residents in Northwest Territories, is try to bring another mine on stream for residents of the N.W.T. so we have jobs, revenue, and the best potential of this site being non-competitive with the Cantong property if they were separate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Oral question. Member Frame Lake.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I want to thank the Minister again for that. So, presumably, if we were able to sell the site and the new owner were to take it over, why wouldn't the new owner apply for a court's mining land use approval? Why are we doing it now? Merci, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Minister of Industry, Tourism and Investment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Oh, we are the owners of this property right now, and if we want to continue on activities of this site, we have to renew this permit. We don't know how long this process is going to take place. We've engaged with the federal government. We have agreed to look at selling these two pieces of property together to get the best potential from both sites by doing them at once, and we will continue to work towards that, and we think this is in the best interest of the residents of the Northwest Territories. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Time for oral question has expired. Written questions. Written questions. Returns to written questions. Returns to written questions. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Replies to Commissioner's opening address. Petitions. Petitions. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move, seconded by the honourable member for the SAW2, that committee report 11-18 brackets 3 report on the review of the 2015-16 and 2016-17 N.W.T. Human Rights Commission annual reports be deemed read and printed in Hansard in its entirety. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. The motion's in order to the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Oh, sorry. Member for Cam Lake.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, colleagues. I move, seconded by the honourable member for Hay River North, that committee report 11-18 brackets 3, Standing Committee on Government Operations report on the review of the 2015 and 2016-17 Northwest Territories Human Rights Commission annual reports be received and adopted by the Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Motion's in order to the motion. Question's been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Standing Special Committee. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Member for Nahende.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wish to report to the Assembly that the Standing Committee on Social Development has reviewed Bill 32, Naturopathic Profession Statutes Amendment Act, and wishes to report that Bill 32 is ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Merci. Reports of Committee on the Review of Bills. Reports on Committee on Review of Bills. Tabling of documents. Tabling of documents. Notices of motion. Notices of motion. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Notices of motion for first reading of bills. Motions. Motions. First reading of bills. First reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Second reading of bills. Consideration Committee of Bills and Other Matters. Minister's Statement 131-18.3. Table document 322-18 bracket 3 with member Hay River North in a chair.
committee. I will now call Committee of the Whole to order. What is the wish of committee, Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, committee would like to consider table document 322-18 brackets 3, main estimates 2019-2020, and would like to start with the Department of Justice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The committee will consider the document after a very brief recess. Thank you. I will call Committee of the Whole back to order. Committee, we have agreed to consider table document 322-18 brackets 3 capital main estimates 2019-2020. The Minister of Finance, I understand, does not have opening remarks, so we will move right into the department that we agreed to consider, the Department of Justice. Does the Minister of Justice have any opening remarks? Minister Siebert?
Yes, thank you, I do. I am pleased to present the 2019-2020 main estimates for the Department of Justice. Overall, the department's estimates propose an increase of just over $3 million, or 2.4% over the 2018-2019 main estimates. Highlights of the proposed estimates include $1.389 million in forced growth funding to provide the RCMP with increased capacity to cover the costs of officer participation in new and existing training initiatives and related administrative costs. $179,000 in forced growth funding to enable the Legal Aid Commission to add a new full-time criminal defense lawyer position in response to rising workloads in this area. $171,000 to cover a 1% wage increase for non-unionized employees. $308,000 in federal funding to support investments related to the legalization of cannabis in the Northwest Territories. $269,000 to increase the department's capacity to support N.W.T departments in responding to access and privacy matters in a more consistent and efficient manner, and $124,000 to support the establishment of a manager position within the Legal Aid Commission to address operational pressures. These estimates continue to support the priorities of the 18th Legislative Assembly by implementing improvements to corrections programming, including the development of enhanced culturally appropriate programming, and working with our community partners to support inmates with their reintegration back into their communities, supporting the RCMP and communities to strengthen partnerships, implementing innovative ways to prevent and reduce crime, and supporting initiatives and partnerships to prevent and reduce family violence. That concludes my opening remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Do you wish to bring witnesses into the chamber?
Yes, please.
Thank you, Minister. Sergeant at Arms, would you please escort the Minister's witnesses into Minister Siebert, please introduce your witnesses to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To my left is Mandy Bolstad, Director of Corporate Services. Thank you. To my right is Martin Goulney, the Deputy Minister of Justice. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. It's been a while since we've been in committee, or welcome to the witnesses. It's been a while since we've been in Committee of the Whole, so I'll just remind everyone to let us know when you're finished talking so that our tech team can change the mics. So just say thank you and the team will know to change the mics, and all exchange goes through myself as chair. Committee, we earlier agreed to forego opening comments. So if that is still the wish of committee, we can begin with the Department of Justice detail. The department itself begins on page 264 of the document. And the first item is community justice and policing, found on page 271. Does committee have questions on community justice and policing? Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I have questions on page 268, the revenue summary. Is that a page that we're going to go back to? Thank you.
Thank you. The plan was to go through each activity, and then when we go back to the departmental total, we can consider the org charts, the revenue summaries, etc., in the opening portion of the document. Is that acceptable to committee? Thank you. So was there anything on the community justice and policing, Ms. Green?
Yes, thank you. This seems like a good time to ask the minister again about community approaches to sexual assault reporting and sexual assault charges that can be reviewed. Last week, he didn't have any answers to these questions about when or how this would happen, and I'm wondering if he has been able to obtain more information that he would like to share with us now. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister Siebert?
Thank you. I don't know if I have anything really new than the information that I provided in the House last week. We are, of course, aware about how important this issue is, and we are continuing to work with the RCMP with respect to this matter. Of course, this arose out of a report in 2017 in the Globe and Mail, and led to questions about this whole issue not only in this House but across Canada. And the police have made efforts. In December 2017, the police released the results of their national review in a document called The Way Forward, and this included actions to make the police more sensitive and aware, if I can put it that way, and through training to sexual assaults. And so work is continuing in this important area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Green?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, my concern in this area is that the Unfounded series that kicked off the debate about third-party review of sexual assault complaints that are considered unfounded. This started 2 years ago, and the third-party reporting of sexual assaults has been requested since before that. So my question for the minister is, at what point are we going to see a justification for increasing the grants and contributions in this portion of the budget, indicating that action is actually being taken on these two issues? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We are working with our partners in the RCMP with respect to this important matter, and of course, once we determine the path forward, we likely would require further funding, if such funding is required, which would seem likely. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Green?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, the minister has said a number of times about how important this issue is, and yet I have to say that there is no progress on this issue. There are, an examination of approaches and a refinement of approaches and consultation about approaches, but we're still no further towards to implementing any approaches or training staff to use them. So at what point is the minister going to pick up some speed on this file and provide some solutions? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, as I have mentioned numerous times, this is an important issue, and we do continue to work with our partners in the RCMP. Clearly, the RCMP internally have made what I would suggest are significant advances arising out of the report that I referenced earlier called The Way Forward, the RCMP Sexual Assault Review and Victim Support Action Plan. Now, we are working with the RCMP with respect to third-party reporting. That is an important issue, so progress has been made. Further progress is clearly needed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Ms. Green?
Thank you. Yes, further progress is needed, and it needs to happen. I would suggest it needs to happen in a quicker way. During our consideration of the business plan, the minister told us that regular members of the G Division will be required to have completed the course called Consent Law and Common Sexual Assault Myths by the end of this fiscal year. Could the minister update us with how many of the G Division staff have actually completed this training? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. All regular members will be required, as I understand it, to complete the Consent Law and Common Sexual Assault Myths course, which was specifically created to address the issues identified in the RCMP's Sexual Assault Review and Victim Support Action Plan. As of January 21st, 2019, 139 members, or 71.2%, have completed the course. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Ms. Green?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister for that information. So what are the chances that the remaining 29% of the members will have completed the training by the end of this fiscal year? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Of course, that is the objective, as I mentioned previously, to have all regular members complete this course. I don't have a date, but hopefully, as I say, all will be able to complete the course, and I will check on that to see and inform committee, should they wish, as to progress. As I say, 139 members, I'm told, or 71.2%, have completed the course. Clearly, there's another 28.8 that need to. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. So at this point, Minister, you're not able to confirm whether or not all members will complete the course by the end of this fiscal year. Is that correct?
No, I can't confirm that that would be done. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Green?
Thank you. Well, that is the commitment that was made, and so I'm looking for an understanding about why that commitment can't be met. What's the problem? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
My understanding, Mr. Chair, is that that was the RCMP's commitment, and I certainly will keep committee and members apprised as to progress. But again, it's the commitment of the RCMP. There may be operational reasons why they cannot get that done sooner rather than later. Clearly, it's an important issue, and most members have completed the course, most regular members. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Green?
Thank you. Unfortunately, the overall message here is that while the minister says that this issue is important, the walk is not equivalent to the talk, and I feel there's really room for improvement in this, and I encourage him to make those improvements as soon as possible. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Next, I have Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Looking at the expenditures that's going to kick in here in a few months or a few weeks, still allows time for scheduling and planning. My first question related to that is the funding provided by the federal government for cannabis education. Is the department going to be developing or has developed a community by community education plan and schedule? And if the minister recalls, take the Sahtu for example, only 1 of 5 communities were visited by our committee to discuss the legalization of cannabis. And now we've got some money to provide some education about cannabis. Is there a schedule to do that for all 33 communities? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely, and I believe this is the right section for that comment, perhaps, or for that question. Perhaps we can just get some clarification and an answer from the department if it is. Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't think we've quite reached that level of detail yet, but Mr. Goldney might be able to expand on my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Goldney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And when it comes to the cannabis implementation work of the Department of Justice and the federal funding that's been directed through the Department of Justice, our role really is limited to RCMP training. So I can't speak to other departments, but I do know that work is underway through the Department of Health and with utilizing federal funding for education. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Goldney. Mr. McNeely?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, maybe if the department could work with the Department of Health in providing some consultation, education sessions, either at the public level or at the school level in the coming fiscal year. So I put that out as a suggestion to the department. There's still time before this budget kicks in. You've got $308,000 there for that. And I imagine it could be shared on a 50-50 basis with the health department. So increasing the resources there would address targeting all 33 communities. My next question is on the RCMP participation. You have 1.3 million allowed for forced growth there in providing the RCMP with increased capacity. And on your opening remarks, mentioning supporting the RCP and communities to strengthen partnerships. That's kind of a broad statement, but I like that, and I just like a little bit of explanation of how you intend to strengthen these partnerships. I know we have a lot of problems in some of these communities, more so in others, but building the social fabric of these communities through education and partnerships with the frontline workers is very healthy and one remedy to the solution of stability. So I'm just wondering how you plan to do that. Is there any preliminary information you can share? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, that certainly is an important question, but I wonder if we might defer that until we get to policing services.
Thank you, Minister. The department the minister has advised that this would be better left until policing services, which is activity. It's one of the later activities. It's found on page 288. Do you have any other questions related to the community justice and policing, Mr. McNeely? And we'll get back to you when we get to policing services. Mr. McNeely?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and yes, we'll move that to the appropriate page there, as you mentioned. The overall Justice Department, and look at the pie expenditures, is good. I'm in support of the department as you move further to once the budget is passed and if it's passed, and implementing the expenditures to improve some of the areas we're going to be suggesting here today. One of the areas I think we really need improvement is rehabilitation and reconciliation program delivery in our North Slave Correctional Center. I think if we can, at any given time, if we went there with a taxi here later on, I think you can find out on hand how much programs is actually being delivered. So I think we can improve in that area. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. And the next section is corrections, and so we'll delve more into that. Do we have anything further from committee? I see Mr. Thompson's on the list.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I guess my first question is about the integrated case management pilot. So has the department improved coordination between the program and the NGOs presently? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, this is an important initiative, and we are always, of course, attempting to improve our delivery of services to our citizens. I think Mr. Goldney might be able to expand a bit on my response, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Goldney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the focus really for the work of the ICM right now has been on continuing the good work and learning lessons, recognizing that it is currently still in the pilot project phase until 2020. But one of the things that we certainly are learning is that there is a huge appetite for broadening the services and making those connections. The focus, frankly, however, has been on running the program as designed currently and learning the lessons that we're learning. As we're doing this, we're very mindful that we do have a bit of a countdown clock here, and we do need to come up with a model that makes sense for expanding and further delivery, not just for Yellowknife, but for all the residents of the Northwest Territories. So we do expect to be able to come forward with a new model that has some new features that will include some of the things that we're hearing from all of our community partners. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Sorry, Mr. Chair, I think the Minister asked to follow up on the information. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister, would you like to add?
Yes, of course, as has been mentioned by the Deputy Minister, that this is a pilot project, and in my view has been a pretty successful project. So we're looking at it moving forward, and as I say, looking at the numbers of referrals, it appears to be a well-used program, but it is, of course, a pilot at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So again, I know it's a pilot project, but so I've heard from the Deputy Minister and the Minister about, potential expansion plans. So can the Minister share, are we starting to do the planning now, or are we waiting until when this pilot project is completed? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Minister?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. We do realize the importance of this, and my Deputy Minister, along with others, is working on this, the whole idea of integration and case management. So, yes, we are working on this, and we're not waiting till the last minute, if that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So can the Minister tell us how long this program has been going on? When did it start? We know it's going to be ended at 2020, so can you tell us when it started and how long it's been running since? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
My understanding is that the pilot was a 3-year program ending in 2020, March 31st, I assume.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So is this program a federally funded program, or is this actually being funded by the territorial government? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is this is funded by our own resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we talk about, I'm going on to another topic in this area here, but when we talk about family violence, is it still the Department of Justice that's taking the lead on this? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is important work and is shared by several departments. Mr. Goldney could perhaps give more detail, but we do realize the importance with this, and it's just not our department. Mr. Goldney?
Thank you. Mr. Goldney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, this work cuts across many departments, including the Department of Health and Social Services, the Housing Corp, and the Department of Education, Culture, and Employment, and other partners as well. So there is a working group that has been tasked with exploring the programs that we have in place now related to this issue, and tasked with coming up with recommendations for improvement and advancement. I wouldn't say the department is the lead, but we certainly do take an active role along with the other participants. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So since it's a multi-departmental approach, how is the work being done or incorporating community partners and the other stakeholders? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Goldney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Right now, the work is focused internally within the N.W.T, but there are many of our programs directed at this work that do involve community partners as well, so that's part of the discussion that is ongoing. But the focus really has been internal. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's my understanding that it's the final year for federal funding for the Family Information Liaison Units. Can the Minister please elaborate on where we are with this work? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, thank you. The Family Information Liaison Units, or FILUs, help missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls find information about what has happened to their loved ones. About 50 family members, I'm told, have asked N.W.T. FILU staff for help with their research. Cases span the years, according to this note, from 1953 to 2018 time frame, and every provincial and territorial government has received federal funding to establish a family information liaison unit. I see that the federal government provided $285,000 in 2017-2018 and $351,000 in 2018-2019 to support the government GNWT's FILU salaries, administration, training, and travel. We are expecting that in 2019-2020, or we're hoping it would likely be a similar amount to those I mentioned earlier. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we're in our last year, but have we approached the federal government and asked if we're going to be expanding this? Because we haven't seen a lot of results right now, and people are, looking forward to, or hoping that we continue this. So have you reached out to the federal minister and asked if they will be expanding this for future years? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
I understand that federal, or rather our officials, have reached out to their counterparts in the federal government regarding this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson?
Thank you. Could the minister elaborate if there's been a positive reception from the federal government in this area? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My understanding is that nothing has been finalized to this point, but that discussions have been encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Thompson, 30 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'll try to get this 30 seconds in and give him a chance to answer the question. Emergency protection orders, has there been any changes or expected changes to this program? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand that there are about 65 emergency protection orders that are judicially confirmed each year. I don't think, and I stand to be corrected if I'm wrong, that we're planning a change in the legislation in this area. We do recognize that this is an important way that we can support victims, and so it is very important, the so-called EPOs. I don't think we're contemplating changes in legislation in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Next, we have Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can the minister confirm the ICE integrated case management pilot has started in 2017 and will run till 2020? Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to change my response because there's a different questioner, but my understanding is that it ends in March, on March 31st, 2020. We're sure of that, and we are confident that it started 3 years ago. So it's a 3-year program, I'm told. Heads are nodding. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister, for assisting us with that complicated math. Mr. Testart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm looking at a news article on the CBC from September of 2017, and in that it's quoted saying that 215 referrals have been made to the program since October of 2015, referencing the integrated case management. Prior to occupying this seat, I spent some time working in the minister's department, and my recollection, and that was prior to 2015, and my recollection was that integrated case management was going on then. So, and why this is relevant, Mr. Chair, is I understand evaluating a 3-year program and determining whether or not, how to proceed. But if this is more like a 6-year program or a 7-year program, then it seems like it should no longer be a pilot. We have officials and the minister saying this is a great program. It needs, we need to keep going with it. So, is this information incorrect? Is my own recollection incorrect? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Perhaps the minister can clarify whether this is a second or third iteration of this program, or what the case may be. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If I might, I'd like to defer the question to Mr. Goldney, that as he may have more accurate information than I possess. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goldney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think the member is correct in his recollection, and that report is accurate. But I do think we have to acknowledge there was a start and a stop to the program with a bit of a redesign along the way. So when we talk about ICM as we're piloting it today, it is the 3-year program. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Goldney. Mr. Testart?
Thank you. So I appreciate that. Are we going to keep piloting this, I guess, this budget is obviously continuing to pilot it, but are we, is this going to be, are we going to see an expansion? Like, when do we get out of the pilot phase? Can the minister shed any light on that, or are we just going to, because if it's 5 or 6 or 7 pilots, it's not a pilot anymore. It's a budget, it's an appropriation for a program. So, again, we can have clarity on the future of the ICM program. Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not certain whether there's any limitation on the number of pilots you can have, but the program, in our view, has been successful. So, cannot commit to this, but I think it's time that we take a very careful look at this. It has been a success, and perhaps it's time to move ahead with to a program that is not a pilot, and in fact that's the goal of the work that we're doing at this time. The department is. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Testart?
Thank you. I'm looking at an undated presentation that's available on the Department of Justice's website, and it indicates short-term outcomes of the project are that being housed in community justice has been a neutralizer. Interdepartmental barrier work is challenging many individual level success, less system level success, and the current ICM model may not be sustainable. Are these still findings of the pilot in its current form, or have these been addressed? Thank you.
Thank you. Minister?
Perhaps I might defer that to Mr. Goldney. I know that there have been challenges, of course, with this program, but overall we see it as a success. But Mr. Goldney might be able to expand on that answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Goldney?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I think the commentary on the program is still accurate. Nevertheless, we do see the pilot as a success, as it is teaching us things along the way, and the goal and work underway is to evolve and direct our resources into something that's a more sustainable model. Again, learning from some of those lessons that we have experienced through the pilot project. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Testart?
Thank you. No, I appreciate that, and I do support this kind of, the wellness court, the DVTO court, they're all very worthwhile alternative methods of supporting people in the system. So I don't want to give the impression that I don't support the program, but what I'm getting at is I agree with you. I'd like to see us take this out of the pilot and move forward, and it sounds like we're in that trajectory, so that's a good thing. And that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Next, we have Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to thank my colleagues. I had some questions about the integrated case management pilot project, but I do want to ask some questions about victim services, if I can. And I note that I think there was a review done back in 2013-14. I know I raised this issue in the House as well with the minister, and I understood that there was going to be a more comprehensive review of victim services in 2019-20. Can the minister confirm that and let me know what level of resources have been allocated for that victim services review? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, thank you. The member has brought this matter to my attention, and I do have a copy of the report from 2014 on my desk. The department is currently preparing the scope for a program review of victim services. The intent is to have a contractor in place early in 2019-2020 and a final report later in the year. This is important. This is an important area, and this report will be a key document to guide us in any future decisions regarding the program and how it's delivered in the Northwest Territories. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the minister for that. Can the minister share that document that he was referring to as some sort of terms of reference or scope of work for the contractor? Can the minister commit to share that with the Standing Committee on Social Development? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Yes, I can undertake to do that. I don't know whether the report or the terms of reference have been finalized yet, but when finalized, we will provide it to the committee or member or both.
Thank you. So for the record, the minister has committed to providing the Standing Committee on Social Development with the terms of reference once finalized. Is that correct, Minister?
Yes, we can do that.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the minister for that commitment. What would work even better in our consensus-style government is if the minister could commit to share it as a draft with the Standing Committee, so the Standing Committee might actually have some input into it, because this is an area of ongoing interest that I and other members have raised. So could the minister commit to share a draft with the Standing Committee in our consensus-style government system? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We always like to cooperate with the committee, and I think we could to meet and provide a draft on a confidential basis. Thank you.
So for clarification, the minister is committing to share a confidential, or committing to share the draft on a confidential basis with committee. Is that correct, Minister? Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to thank the minister for that commitment, and I take it sincerely, and I'm glad to try to work with him on that. I did have some questions around the New Day program. I'm just wondering, I know that when the transition was made from the old program, which was run by a nonprofit, and then it went to a different kind of an arrangement for 5 years with the John Howard Society, where basically they're contracted to provide counseling services. So can the minister tell us how well the new approach on the New Day program is actually working? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, I think I can provide some figures that will assist in understanding where we're at with this program. I'm looking at the number of registrations, which has changed a bit over the years. Now, not all registrations, unfortunately, lead to completions, but 2013, there were 29, 14, 13, 2015, 37, 2016, 47, 2017, 24, and 2018, 50 completions, and this is often disappointing. We're 0 in 2013, 14, 2 in 15, 17 in 2016, 5 in 2017, and 5 in 2018. Now, one thing that I would like to add is that men who are in custody at NSCC can register to meet with the counselor when he next visits the correctional center. The NSCC group meets twice weekly. I sought some more information on this, and I understand that the entire program can be completed while in custody, by inmates while in custody. So I think that that's an enhancement of what was done before, because I don't know if you could do that before. I think it was mainly for those that... 24-week period. Yeah. So, again, the numbers, there seem to be a lot of registrations, and completions are disappointing, frankly. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Minister, for that summary. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the minister for providing those numbers. Can individuals who are in remand, can they access the New Day program? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Of course, this is a voluntary program that people have to agree to enter into. I understand they can, while on remand, enter into the program. Of course, one of the problems with remand, their release date, if that's the right word, or the date that they will no longer be in remand, is sometimes not known because they have upcoming court dates. So I don't know whether that might be a discouragement to them from entering into the program, but they do have the ability to enter into the program. Sometimes they're on remand for a very long period of time and could avail themselves of this program. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the minister for that. So if, just so I understand this, when an individual, if they complete the remand and they're discharged, can they still continue with the program? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Yes, my understanding is that you can commence the program while in custody and complete it when out of custody, if that's the question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thanks to the minister for that. I do support a more flexible program that is available to folks that need it, so that's good to hear. Do we have, can the minister tell us, are there any other metrics that are used to measure the success of this program other than registrations, completions, and so on? Is there any attempt to measure recidivism are there any other metrics that are used to measure success? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure whether we have that information available. I don't think we do. And yes, I mean, that would be important. I do understand the importance of the question, because I mean, it does take considerable effort to get through the program, and there are, over the years, not that many completions. It would certainly be discouraging to know if there had been recidivism amongst those that completed. That would be very disappointing. I don't know whether we would have the ability to access that information. Do we know who goes into the programs? During intakes for the case managers, they would. Okay. Anyway, I get the point. We do not have that information. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks to the Minister and his staff there. I don't have any further questions, but I guess I'd like to encourage the department to think a little bit more about how we actually measure the success of the New Day program moving forward beyond just registrations and completions. I think that's just numbers in and so on. I want to know how effective the program actually is, and I think the Minister would want to know that information as well. But thanks to the Minister and his staff for the answers to the questions. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Would the Minister like to respond?
I understand the question or the comment very well, because as I said before, there's not much point having a program if it's not successful. We'll look into it. I don't know. I don't think there would be privacy issues involved in this, but I will look into it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Thank you, Minister. Justice, Community Justice and Policing, Operations Expenditure Summary, Activity Total, $5,547,000. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Mr. Bolio?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the chair rise and report progress. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. There's a motion to report progress. Will the minister please take his seat? The motion is in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. I will rise and report progress. Thank you to the witnesses. Sergeant at Arms, please escort the witnesses from the chamber.
May I have the report, Member Hay River North?
Mr. Speaker, your committee has been considering table document 322-18, brackets 3, main estimates 2019-2020, and would like to report progress. And Mr. Speaker, I move that the report of the Committee of the Whole be concurred with.
Merci. Do I have a seconder? Member for Yellowknife North. Motion's in order. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion carried. Merci. Third reading of bills. Third reading of bills. Mr. Clerk, orders of the day.
Orders of the day for Thursday, February 21st, 2019, 1:30 p.m. Prayer, minister statements, member statements, returns to oral questions, recognition of visitors in the gallery, acknowledgments, oral questions, returns to written questions, replies to the Commissioner's opening address, petitions, reports of standing and special committees, reports of committees on the review of bills, tabling of documents, notices of motion for the first reading of bills, motions, first reading of bills, Bill 36 and Bill 37, second reading of bills, consideration in Committee of the Whole of bills and other matters, Minister Statement 131-18 bracket 3, and table document 322-18 bracket 3. Report of Committee of the Whole, third reading of bills, orders of the day.
Mr. Clerk, this House stands adjourned until Thursday, February 21st, 2019 at 1:30 p.m.
Order.